Hi, I just wanted to give a quick walkthrough of an API tester app that I made that I call Papirus, like API Papyrus. Okay, so this is just an app that a developer could use to look at different API calls that they're using, like the methods and the URLs that they're calling, look at the HTTP headers and response that they're sending, and the type of the content type for the HTTP call, and then also to send the call and to see what the HTTP response looks like in return as well. So I was building this app with a kind of connected car in mind. So I decided to go with the idea of having gas delivered to your car and to have a look at how much gas is left in your tank and to schedule a delivery and things. Okay, so I have 4 different APIs. I have a get, a post, a put, and a delete call, all to the same URL, so they're RESTful routes. Okay, so the get request just gets information about like the gas data in your car. So if I send API call, it gives me back so the name of the car owner, which is my name, Jill Robinson, my email address, the type of car I have, and the level of gas and type of gas that I use. So I have 70% of my fuel tank is full, and my cell number. So the post request just deals with making a new gas delivery. So here, if I say I want to have gas delivered today, I also have validations on these form fields. So things like if I want to change my email address or my cell number, then I can do that here as well. If I click to send API call without putting name in, it will alert me that I have to fill my name in. So Jill Robinson, and then send API call, and it will schedule my next delivery. So the same for the put request. The put is just to update the delivery date. So if I want to change the date of my delivery, I can just copy and paste my name in there, and then say change it to Saturday instead of today. Send the API call, and it gives me my next delivery date as compared to my previous delivery date, which was today. And also, if I call this get request again, it updates it with the date of the delivery as well. And if any of these other fields change, like email address or owner name or anything, it also changes those. So delete again. If I just put my name in there, this is to delete the scheduled gas delivery for the car. So if I send the API call, it'll send it back, and you can see that it's missing the next delivery key in the response. So it's deleted the delivery from the object. So if I look at my code, I built this in React on the front end and Node on the back end. So this is my Node server, so I'm using Express as well. So I have my gas object here, which has my name and my email address and things in. That's just a mock result to send back from the API call. So I have my get function for my root route, just to serve up my index.html file. And then I also have my routes for get, post, put, and delete for my different API calls, all to the same route. So I just have some if checks here for each one, saying if request.body, request.name, or if request.body.email, name, or phone have changed, then to just update it in this gas object that I'm passing back, or else just in the case of the post, put, and delete routes, to change this next delivery date so that it can either create it or update it or delete it for the gas delivery. And for the get request, I'm just sending that gas object back in a res.json as well. Okay, so because I'm using React for this, I have an index.html file, but it doesn't really contain much. It just has a link to my bundled React code and an ID for the container that I'm targeting, so the div that I want to put my content inside. And it also has a link to my style sheet as well for my CSS. Okay, so this is kind of like part of my main React code. So this is a JSX file. So I'm importing React at the top here, and I'm also importing from two of the files here. So I'm importing this endpoints object, which I'll show you in a second, and this API component, which is another React component that I'm using. So endpoints.js, this is kind of like a mock HTTP request object. So it contains kind of like the name of the API call that you're going to be making in a description, the URL, the method, any request headers that you have, and also a request body. So you can see here I have like the body contains email, name, and cell phone number. And then for the others, for the put and post requests where you're dealing with the dates, it has a date field as well. So I'm just using this endpoints object, or it's actually an array of objects, to mock my data to put in the page for the API calls. So that comes into play in this app.jsx file. I've made this component called app, a React component, and it displays my title and things at the top of my page. And then when it comes to endpoints, it's mapping over endpoints. So endpoints is an array, so you can call this map function, and what that does is it loops through every object in your array and it calls a function on that index in your array. So in this case, I'm passing it an arrow function, and what that function is it returns this new other React component called API, and it pulls out anything from that endpoints object that I've passed in. So the method and the URL for that particular route, the name, the description, etc. And it puts them just into this API component. So the API component is in a separate file that was also imported at the top of this file here. So this has been split off into separate files so that it's a standalone component that could be used by someone else if they wanted to just use the component rather than the whole file and server and everything. Okay, so API is its own class, and we have to call the constructor function at the beginning of the class just to set up the state as a new object and things, and to create the state object. And there are a couple of other functions here on blur and on click, which are dealing with kind of form validation and submission for the form on the page here, these forms. It's dealing with the submission and the validation for these forms. I'm not going to walk through all of it right now because I don't have time on this video, but yeah, the code is on my GitHub if anyone wants to look at it. Okay, so the main part of this JSX component is this the API component. So this render function deals with this API component. So it's pulling out any of the information that was passed in from this endpoints object in here, because we're instantiating API components every time with each one of the endpoint objects. So each one of those objects from this array to deal with the GET request or the POST request, they're being pulled out and they're being passed into here and stored in this.props, which deals with the properties for the component. So this.props.methods relates to the GET or the PUT or the POST, as do this.props.url, it deals with that URL. So everything that was from that endpoints file is now stored in props within this API component. So I'm mainly just pulling out bits of that data. So I'm putting the name and the description onto the page so that you can see it here. So like name, cancel delivery, description, cancel an existing gas delivery. The content type is always going to be application JSON. And then for things like the request headers, because that's an object, I'm using object.keys to pull out the keys for the object. And then using map again to loop over each one and to put it into a p tag on the page. So that was the content type is application JSON. That's the HTTP headers that came from the endpoints file. And then for the body, because we want to be able to change parts of the body, like the name that's associated with the API call, or the cell number, or the email address. These have been put inside a form. So every time we loop through this props.body using map again, we're pulling out the fields from the body, like the name and the type of field it is, so whether it's a name or an email address or a cell phone number. And we also want to give an associated input field for each of those fields so that we can change it if we want to. So that's inside a form, and on submit, we if we click this button down here, which is a separate React component in itself, if we click that button, it submits the form and it calls the onSubmit function, which is, sorry, I think I passed it, this .onBlur. So all that does is it kind of helps to validate the form to make sure that any required fields that you have are filled in, any fields that have a maximum or minimum character length, those requirements are met. Things like cell phone number, I have a regex for the pattern for the cell phone number to make sure that it fits kind of like 3 digits, then a dash, and then 4 digits, that kind of pattern. And then if everything works properly, it executes the HTTP request to the API using fetch. So it just uses the fetch API, it passes in the URL and this init var object, which just contains the methods and the headers. And also, if it's not a GET request, it also includes the body, which is anything that's been pulled out from the form. If anyone's changed anything, like adding a delivery date. And so it sends all of that information off in the API call to the server side, and then it responds with the gas object that I set up in my server file. And once it gets that object back, because we're dealing with promises, so it's async code, we have to wait for the response to come back. It then sets the returned object, the JSON object for the response, into the state object again, so it's held in state, it can remember it, and then we're pulling that response out and displaying it on the page here. So that's what this response is down here. So that was just a quick walkthrough of how my code works. I probably haven't explained it that well, but I hope it's not too confusing. I also just quickly wanted to cover, I wrote some tests as well. Just for the server code, I was using Mocha and Chai. You can use Mocha to run these tests where you describe what you're expecting. You tell the testing, the Mocha test that you want to test to see if it returns a 200 status code, or to test to see if it returns the details for the gas object in the GET request. And because fetch API is a client-side, we have client-side tool, we have to use request, which is a library for the server side, to make the HTTP call like it's coming from the client, when really it's kind of on the server side more. But we just again pass it the URL and then a callback for once the URL returns. And we use Chai to give these expect keywords here. So we say we expect the result of calling this HTTP call to give us a status code that is equal to 200, or we expect the object that we get back, so like the gas details object, to contain keys that have the owner name or the car make as the name of the key. So those were just some tests that I've also written to just quickly run through each of the API calls and check that they all work and that they're all returning the right kind of thing. So I hope this was a helpful video, and thank you for listening.